Welcome to News from Neptune for the 48th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. That begins by calling things by their right names, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them at all. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent that there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China, notably. Since the last decade of that century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky. First on a so-called local community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things tonight on a Trump and Left edition of News from Neptune. The term Trump and Left was coined by our friend Paul Street. The meanings of the term takes a minute from an analysis offered by C.J. Hopkins. We've said often on this program that the poets often get there first. Hopkins is a playwright, which is as good as a poet in most venues, and has done a remarkable job of talking about contemporary American politics with a poetic edge, a satirical approach that sometimes causes consternation in and of itself. Our friend Jeffrey Sinclair, editor of Counterpunch, who's much taken up in this piece by Hopkins, has said for years that Counterpunch doesn't publish satire during the week because people take it too seriously. They occasionally try to slip in a satire piece on the weekend, hoping that a more relaxed audience will forgive them the form. In any case, what we have from C.J. Hopkins today is a piece called Beware the Trump and Left. You may not have heard about one of the Russians' most insidiously evil active measures, an active measure so insidiously evil that it can only have been dreamed up in Moscow, the current wellspring of insidious evil. The Trump and Left, or Sputnik Left, as it's sometimes called in reference to the news outlet Sputnik, the Trump and Left is a gang of nefarious Putin Nazi infiltrators posing as respectable leftists in order to disseminate Trumpian ideology and Putin Nazi propaganda. Since I consider myself a member of the Trump and Left by their definition, this may take some explaining. The aim of these insidious Trump and Left infiltrators is to sow confusion, chaos, and discord among actual, real, authentic leftists who are going about the serious business of calling Donald Trump a fascist on the internet 25 times a day, verbally abusing Julian Assange, occasionally pulling down oppressive statues, and sharing videos of racist idiots acting like racist idiots in public. The Trump and Left is determined to sabotage this revolutionary work, mostly by tricking these actual leftists into critically thinking about a host of issues that there's no good reason to critically think about. Global capitalism, national sovereignty, immigration, identity politics, corporate censorship, and other issues that there is no conceivable reason to discuss or debate or even casually mention unless you're some kind of Russia-loving Nazi. The Trump and left is legion and growing. Its membership includes a handful of prominent fake leftist figures, Glenn Greenwald, who many among the resistance, trademark, would like to see renditioned and indefinitely detained in some offshore Trump and left gulag somewhere. Matt Taibbi, who just published a treasonous article challenging the right of the U.S. government to prosecute publishers as enemy agents for publishing material they don't want published. Julian Assange, who is one such publisher, and who the U.S. has scheduled for public crucifixion just as soon as they can get their hands on him. Aaron Maté of the Real News Network, a notorious Trump-Russia collusion denialist. Caitlin Johnstone, an Australian blogger and poet who the red-brown Putin Nazi hunters at Counterpunch have become totally obsessed with. Diana Johnstone, who they also don't like, and full disclosure, your humble narrator. This is C.J. Hopkins, who is writing this piece, alerting you to the Trump and left plots. Now, normally, the opinions of some political journalists and rather marginal political writers would amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. Extra points for getting the reference there, by the way. I'll mention sometime why.
Just looking at you.
Of all the gin joints in all the town and all the world, she had to walk into mine. Okay. I told you it was going to be like this tonight. But
Okay.
the global capitalist ruling classes need to make an example of Trump and Assange and anyone else who's had the gall to mess with their global empire. Part of how they're going to do this is to further polarize the already extremely polarized ideological spectrum until everyone is forced onto one or the other side of the pro or anti-Trump equation, or a pro or anti-populist equation, or a pro or anti-fascist equation. This is the terms of the game. As you probably noticed, The Guardian, the British paper, the liberal British paper, has just launched a special 6-week investigative series exploring the whole new populism phenomenon. We've mentioned that here occasionally, which began with a lot of scary photos of Steve Bannon next to the word populism. We're going to be hearing a lot about populism over the course of the next 2 years. We're going to be hearing how populism is actually not that different from fascism, or at the very least is inherently racist and anti-Semitic and xenophobic, and how basically anyone who criticizes neoliberal elites or the corporate media is Russian-loving, pro-Trump Nazi. It's straightforward once you begin to get the equations. And this is where this Trump and left malarkey fits into the ruling class's broader campaign to eliminate any kind of critical thinking and force people to mindlessly root for their team. See, the problem with us Trump and left types is not that we support Donald Trump. For the record, none of us really do. Some of us think he's a dangerous demagogue. Other of us think he's a blithering idiot. None of us think he's Fidel Castro, or that he cares one iota about the working classes, or about anyone other than perhaps Donald Trump. No, the problem is not that we're on the wrong team. The problem is that we're asking people to question the propaganda of the team that we're supposed to be on, or at least to be rooting for. We're asking people to pay attention to how the global capitalist ruling establishment is going about quashing this populist insurgency, of which Brexit and Trump are manifestations, not causes, so they can get back to the business of relentlessly restructuring, privatizing, and debt enslaving everything, as they've been doing since the end of the Cold War. We're asking folks not to join the other team, but to pay close attention to how they are being manipulated into believing that there are only two teams, and that they have to join one, and then mindlessly parrot whatever nonsense their team decides they need to disseminate in order to win a game that is merely a simulation they've conjured up, i.e. the ruling classes have conjured up, in order to inoculate themselves against an actual conflict they cannot win and so must prevent at all costs from ever beginning, which they're doing a pretty good job of so far. In other words, the problem with us Trump and lefters is the prospect of defeating a fake Russian Hitler and restoring neoliberal normality in the USA and the rest of the West is just not all that terribly inspiring. So rather than regurgitating the Russian hysteria, you see what happens to me when I try to. So rather than regurgitating the Russian hysteria and the fascism hysteria that is being produced by the global capitalist ruling establishment to gin up support for their counterinsurgency, we're continuing to focus on the capitalist ruling classes, which are actually still running things globally and will be running things long after Trump is gone, and this is all in caps, imminent threat of global fascist takeover of everything has disappeared, as the imminent threat of nuclear terrorist backpack attack disappeared before it. Or maybe all that is just a ruse, an attempt on my part to dupe you into going out and buying a MAGA hat and shouting racist abuse at Honduran kids, assuming you can find some in your vicinity. You never know with us Trump and left types. Probably the safest thing to do to protect yourself from our insidious treachery is to start your own personal Trump and left blacklist and spread lies about us all over the internet, or just report us to Twitter or Facebook or somebody, whoever you feel are the proper authorities. The main thing is to shut us up or prophylactically delegitimize us to keep us from infecting other leftists with our filthy nonconformist ideas. The last thing we need at a time like this is a bunch of leftists thinking for themselves and questioning official leftist dogma. Who knows what kind of behavior that might lead to? That's C.J. Hopkins, a poet, describing for us the insidious Trump and left, of which I'm happy to say I'm a member. What about you, David?
Not card carrying, but I'm interested in this line of thinking, and I'm interested in this critique. It's interesting that C.J. Hopkins, who usually writes on Counterpunch, did not, if I'm getting this right, did not have this article on Counterpunch.
That's right.
So he was forced to put it. I just Googled in order to find it after you sent it to me.
Right.
I Googled part of it and found that it was at uns.com, among other, maybe a couple of other places.
Right.
So uns.com is exactly the kind of sort of conspiracy theorist website that is publishing something like this. So he's being forced into this pigeonhole in which some people will look at this and say, well, this is like our friend Louis Proyect.
Exactly.
This is on the uns.com website. And uns has been somebody associated with marginally insane people like Lyndon LaRouche and so forth. So it gets very, very complicated.
It does.
Until now, you've been able to read C.J. Hopkins on the Counterpunch website, along with some other people that are categorized in this Trump and left, like Diana Johnstone.
Right.
And
who has also been excluded from Counterpunch, by the way.
I think so. So this goes back a long way. This sort of dynamic goes back a long way, all the way to when Alexander Coburn was still living, and in a somewhat different way than Jeffrey St. Clair and Joshua Frank have been doing, defining what the parameters of debate, and also, obviously, before Trump came into power, sort of heightening all this conflict.
You're absolutely right, David. This is exactly what seems to be going on, and I must admit that I'm astonished at it, that the argument has taken the form that it has. We should say a word about Counterpunch and the UNS website here in this regard. I've made no secret of the fact that the editors of Counterpunch are longtime friends for whom I have great admiration as the original editors of Counterpunch. I'm a little less sure about some of the more recent editors. But what amazes me about this piece of Hopkins is that it seems to me, it reads to me, as very much in the tone, manner, and content of the late Alex Coburn, one of the founders of Counterpunch and a great associate of Jeffrey Sinclair. But in the process of Hopkins writing about the Trump and left, he has had a serious falling out with the editors of Counterpunch, whom he would condemn now as fostering this Trump and left notion. Now, it's also bound up with the UNSWED site that you talk about, that your friend Louis Proyak has been so concerned about. And that's another strange kettle of fish. UNS publishes, puts on his website, once again, free of charge, of course, a wide range of political views, such as those of
Norman Finkelstein, for one.
well, Norman Finkelstein, certainly, and I was thinking more of Patrick Buchanan,
Yes, right.
the paleo-conservative and so forth,
right.
and many others, including some of these people who have been characterized as new anti-Semites, as Unz himself has been. So it is, you can't tell the players without a program at the moment,
Yeah.
and the programs are being rewritten
Yeah.
even as we speak.
Yeah, part of it goes back to Alexander Coburn's penchant for contrarian views, some of which took a lot of courage.
Yes.
That I agree with, and others that were not so much in terms of his skepticism about climate change. But still, Alexander Coburn was on top of the kind of the governmental anti-cult movements that ended up in Waco in
Right.
1993. He was critical, harshly critical of course, of the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Centers, and their focus on hate groups as being somehow a fundamental problem, as opposed to sort of symptomatic of more central problems. And then he had this penchant, which I don't agree with more controversial authors on Counterpunch, that could be defined as anti-Semites, even if they were Jewish, like Israel Shamir and Gilad Atzmon.
Right.
Neither of whom I ever got into all that much, but I can understand what the criticism of Coburn was in that context. And also these paleo-conservative writers, not just Patrick Buchanan, who I don't think ever appeared on Counterpunch, but a couple of people that still appear on Counterpunch. William Bovard is one of those, and a guy named James Bovard, and a guy named William Lind, who are associated with this paleo-conservative sort of Pat Buchananite way of looking at the world that gets some things right, although in a different ideological context than what I would support.
And
so it gets very confusing again. You can't tell the players without a scorecard, but let the players play.
Yes. The important thing is to get things right,
Yeah.
regardless of the ideological context that you're talking about. And I think that's what Hopkins is suggesting here. And I must say his sort of racketing style, his humorous approach to this, reminds me of no one so much as Alexander Coburn, who used to make fun of the piece you just mentioned, for example, that the Southern Poverty Law Center is a laugh riot. It's a send-up of an organization that Coburn saw as fake, a money-making scheme for its author. I've gotten recently, I mean, within the last couple of months, nasty notes from people who say, how dare I criticize the Southern Poverty Law Center because the Southern Poverty Law Center is standing against racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I usually send them one of Coburn's columns on the subject. And that's why the crucial figure in this affair, this is a little in-house, the crucial figure in this matter is Coburn's associate, longtime associate and friend and good friend, who now edits Counterpunch. And I must admit, I am simply surprised at where Jeffrey Sinclair is these days.
So just to put this in more concrete terms, a couple of articles one article that appeared early this year, January 19th, on Counterpunch, sort of expressing this contrarian view, a lot of it which had to do with criticism, which obviously justified criticism of the FBI and the way they had handled things over the years. You don't even have to go back to J. Edgar Hoover, of course, but of course you should.
Yes.
This fellow James Bovard, who is kind of a paleocon or libertarian, you might want to call him. He wrote an article just this past January 19th called "Why Ruby Ridge Still Matters." That was in 1992 when the FBI killed the wife of a man named Randy Weaver, a right-wing survivalist, white supremacist, I think. And he wrote James Bovard wrote a very critical article of about how that all went down. Well, when this story of Ruby Ridge is woven in to the accepted perspective of how events that eventually led to Waco and to Oklahoma City, it's lost what the FBI was actually doing. And when Waco itself is woven into this narrative that takes us to Oklahoma City and the bombing of the federal building there, again, it becomes a story of the rise of the white supremacist right, or of the white power movement, or the modern version of that. And things are gotten wrong because it's not understand. They just marginalized what the responsibility of the FBI was in doing that. So let me just read what Alexander Coburn wrote in 1993, subsequent to Waco, in April of 93, subsequent to Waco, in his column that he was writing for the LA Times.
You might say just a word about what Waco was.
Waco was the attack on the Branch Davidian complex, David Koresh, who was a quote-unquote cult member. And this plays into Coburn's understanding of the anti-cult cult.
The attack was by the FBI and killed a lot of people, and that was...
So 3 short paragraphs here. Outside, and he's referring to Janet Reno, who was running this...
Attorney General.
Attorney General, Bill Clinton's Attorney General. Right. Outside Waco, Reno again went that extra mile, rejecting mediation offered by prominent religious groups. Instead, for 6 hours, the FBI pumped CS2 with some kind of gas into a compound containing children too small to where the gas masks allegedly stockpiled by the Davidians. It now seems likely that the M60 tank knocked over kerosene for the compound's lamps, which the feds knew about, and almost everyone burned alive. This appalling event, according to Alexander Coburn, took place on April 19th, 1993, the 50th anniversary of the Nazi assault on the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. The Nazis, too, regarded cults, quote-unquote, as ripe candidates for persecution. On July 20th, 1937, the SS Reichsfuhrer Reinhard Heydrich ordered the banning and persecution of small religious sects, including the Seventh-day Adventists. Today, meaning in 1993 in Coburn's writing, in the United States, similar intolerance is being sedulously fanned not only by such bodies as the Cult Awareness Network, but by powerful publications such as Time, which illustrated its 1990 cover story attack on the Church of Scientology with a graphic of an octopus, the identical graphic used by the Nazis in their persecution of the sects.
This is exactly right, and this is why it seems to me that this is part of the reason it seems to me that if Coburn were around right now, he would be on Hopkins' side, because he was condemned at the time by people who called themselves leftists, saw themselves as the American left. He was condemned at the time for his discussions with the Ruby Ridge people, for example, and their associates across the country, and his failure to condemn them outright, his willingness to try to see what their political views actually were, and he was also excoriated for not believing in the satanic sexual abuse that the entire American left in the 1990s thought was going on across the country.
In daycare centers.
Big pardon?
In
Daycare centers, yes,
Yes,
exactly.
and Alexander Coburn was absolutely right about that.
He was.
And took a lot of courage. I mean, that's his most controversial in some ways campaign.
Yes.
But he was absolutely right.
Well, and it seems to me that that same perspicacity that Coburn displayed and wrote about with wit and humor is what Hopkins is up to right now. And it seems to me that it's tragic that that includes a conflict with Coburn's friend and successor, who now edits Counterpunch.
So, if you would indulge me for a minute or two, let me just take this out a little bit.
Sure.
I took the time to watch a recent Frontline documentary on PBS, or on, you can watch it on YouTube or whatever, about the neo-Nazi group subsequent to the Pittsburgh massacre. So they've got their crack documentary team, their crack researchers, their affiliation with ProPublica, doing decent journalism on what the neo-Nazi movement is, who's involved, what kind of a cult this is. It is a cult, and I learned a few things about that I didn't know about this neo-Nazi group, but I left watching this hour-long documentary thinking that in terms of understanding what happened in Pittsburgh, in terms of understanding the right in this country, in terms of understanding their relationship to Donald Trump, if there is any, and you may argue there is some, in a vague kind of way, still, I got the idea that this was a lot of drama and a lot of good documentary, reporting, a lot of sort of glitzy documentary, reporting with, muffled voices and all this kind of stuff, and this one journalist named Thompson, I think, not Hunter Thompson, unfortunately, but that it was a big, really, in terms of insight, a big nothing burger. Not informing us of what's really going on. That in response to what's going on in Pittsburgh. But let's take it from there. Let's look at Barry Weiss, one of the New York Times editors. Let's look at her article in yesterday's New York Times, Europe's Jew hatred and ours. A new CNN poll reveals that 1 in 4 Europeans are anti-Semitic. And then she goes on and on about the basic aspects of what she sees as anti-Semitism in terms of the right. Okay, that was Pittsburgh. In terms of most Muslims, especially in Europe, and then she just throws in, perhaps predictably, she just throws this in, just to show how lunatic this whole thing has gotten. Now at a third, and Barry Weiss is a Zionist neocon. Okay, now she writes. Now add a third ingredient to this toxic brew: the fashionable anti-Semitism of the far left that masquerades as anti-Zionism and anti-racism. No political leader in Europe embodies that sentiment more than Britain's Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn.
Oh my God!
He paid respects. Did you read this?
No, I didn't.
He paid respects at the memorial of the Palestinian perpetrators of the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre. He objected to the destruction of a street mural depicting despotic, hook-nosed Jewish bankers. He participated for over a decade in the activities of a group called Der Yassin Remembered. Der Yassin was a Zionist massacre of Palestinians in 1948, which was led by a Holocaust denier. He publicly defended a virulently anti-Semitic victor named Stephen Sizer. he invited an Islamist preacher who believes Jews use Gentile blood for religious reasons to tea at the parliament, and so on. And yet he adamantly, Jeremy Corbyn, the sort of the British Bernie Sanders, even though he's not Jewish, more left than Bernie Sanders. And yet he adamantly denies being an anti-Semite on the grounds that he has devoted his life to exposing racism in any form, quote unquote, which he certainly has. If you want to hear a more elaborate takedown of the kind of what's been going on in Britain in relation to Jeremy Corbyn, the last couple of episodes of the podcast Moderate Rebels with Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal have been devoted to an interview with a British journalist named Carrie Ann Mendoza, editor of the British news site The Canary, not to be confused with Canary Mission, that's a completely different thing. And so you can get the truth basically from there. And from Barry Weiss, we can learn that there is nothing that this neocon Zionist will not do in order to sort of implicate the left in the Pittsburgh massacre, to put it in, to sort of oversimplify it. And that's what we should be talking about. What this center, she represents the center of power as much as Donald Trump does. I mean, the New York Times, and represents the centers of power that don't like Donald Trump, and we should be talking about that.
Every time I think that the Russiagate madness, and it's madness with a method, of course, in this country has reached levels that I would never have imagined and can't possibly get crazier, I look at the anti-Semitism campaign against Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party, and realize that I am once again being naive, that the level of madness in Britain is, in regard to that matter, is exceeded Russiagate in this country. Incredible. And it seems to me that we need to recognize the roots of these campaigns, and the roots are very much involved with the fear on the part of the ruling class in both Britain and America that their grip is slipping. They have good reasons to believe it. There is indeed a populist upsurge, inchoate and contradictory in various ways, going on in both countries and indeed in Europe as a whole, and a populist upsurge that has produced Brexit and the knots that the UK has tied itself into this week particularly, and has produced Trump in this country. Once again, as Hopkins points out, neither Trump nor Brexit are the causes of this populist movement, but the ruling class in the international capitalist ruling class, if you like, in Britain and America, recognizes that the movement is serious and has thrown up these examples that point out the dismay of the majority of the population with the form of rule that has meant that in the United States, we've had neoliberal policies from 40 years of American governments, and in those 40 years, wages have been flat in America. In that same time, inequality has grown exponentially and has grown at an accelerating rate. The second derivative is positive, if you remember your high school algebra. And the fact of the matter is that it's this that produced it's this transformation of Western capitalist society that produces this inchoate opposition that we speak of as populism. The Guardian newspaper, as I mentioned a moment ago, is running a 6-part series this week telling us about the dangers of populism. Populism equals fascism is the mantra of the resistance to Trump. The reason Trump has to be resisted is, of course, he is the cutting edge of populism that assaults the rule of capital in the U.S. They're not wrong about that. but they are doing their best to make sure that you understand that it's all a Russian Nazi plot, as C.J. Hopkins tells us.
Yeah. So speaking of populism, for my sins, as you like to say, although you never tell us what your sins are.
I'm not sure. I think that's all I do. Go ahead.
Okay. For my sins, I actually watched the presentation that Steve Bannon gave to the Oxford Union.
Oh, huh.
Did you watch it?
I did not watch it. I read about it, but I
Okay,
didn't.
well,
I would. Yeah.
You can watch it on YouTube, of course. And just because I'm curious, because I've never, I've never been sympathetic towards Bannon, but I always at least wanted to understand what he thinks he understands about populism and what populism is and what his kind of populism, which he understands as sort of right-wing populism, how it relates to what he understands as left-wing populism. And there were people you could hear as he was giving this talk in these hollowed halls with their benches and
Right.
their whatever.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah. Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah.
And that you could hear the people chanting outside. You could hear the anti-haters or the anti-populists chanting outside. Kind of crazy. I mean.
Yep.
But anyway, and I wasn't terribly impressed with what he had to say. He's very articulate. He talks fast. He knows what he wants to say. He says it. He describes some things which people on the left can relate to in terms of economic inequality and neoliberalism. He talks about, but then he starts talking about wanting to get rid of the administrative state, and I'm not quite sure what he means by that, and I can't agree. I don't know what to agree
very
with
nice
or
point.
not to agree with in terms of that. But he talks a good game. I don't agree with his kind of populism, but he knows what it is, and he thinks he represents the population, and to a certain extent, he understands them well enough to have been able to strategize Trump's campaign in a way that got them to vote for him. And that doesn't mean just the right-wing hate groups, or even white men or white working class men.
Let's take up that notion of administrative state as Bannon is using it. I think one of Bannon's greatest problems is that he has an analysis that has important truths, for lack of a better term, in it, and he sees them clearly enough, but for all his verbal facility, is unable to present them to an audience that has already determined that populism is racism, for example.
Right.
And he's not aware enough of what he's doing to realize the necessity for attacking the presumptions of his audience. I think of this after spending 40 years as a classroom teacher and coming to the conclusion that the biggest problem classroom teachers have is assuming that if they understand something, then any reasonable person is going to understand it too, and therefore they only have to refer to it or describe it once, and their students will get it. What you don't realize, it seems to me, as a teacher, what I didn't realize many years as a teacher, I'm sure, is that because you know that something is clear, that explaining it in clear terms doesn't immediately make your audience understand that it's clear. And that's the real problem. And I think Bannon is a classic teacher in that regard. Let's take one example here of the administrative state, what he's talking about in terms of the administrative state. He has, from his other writings, a fairly clear understanding, it seems, of how he's using the term. It's actually quite close to the line that we used to start this program. I quote Noam Chomsky, not normally considered an intellectual ally of Steve Bannon's, neither. But I quote Chomsky at the beginning of the program saying that he avoids using the terms capitalism and socialism because they've essentially been evacuated of meaning. That there has been no true capitalism, no real capitalism, since the 1920s. Why, says Chomsky? What's happened since the 1920s is that capitalist organization of society has become state-controlled. The administrative state, the government, if you like, the state and the government are equated in American political discussions. The state has taken over the economy and run it for the capitalists. The capitalism that Marx talked about in the 1840s was a capitalism in which the government stood back. The governments did not control the economy the way governments have controlled the economy in all parts of the world since the First World War. That's the administrative state that Bannon is talking about.
And that's what Leo Panitch talks about in his work.
Exactly, yeah. And because that's understood by the people who've taken the trouble to understand these positions rather than to assume, oh, I'm on the left, I'm on the right, and therefore that's what we believe. Yeah. What's at stake here is the analysis that Bannon offered to Trump. Whether Trump took it or not, I don't know, but it characterized part of his campaign. The analysis that Bannon offered to Trump in the 2016 election was that the election was really not about misogyny. It wasn't even about race. What the election was about was the conflict between corporate globalism and economic nationalism. Those were terms that Bannon would typically use. They are so open to misinterpretation that no one really, I think, paid much attention to what he was saying. He knew, he understood that by corporate globalism, he meant roughly what we talk about as neoliberalism, the organization of the world economy by the American ruling class, by the American corporate leaders to profit themselves. And that occurs not just in the United States, but around the world. The financialization of the American economy and its offshoring was all involved with corporate globalism, establishing a global economy run by and for the purposes of the leading American corporations. Corporate globalism was the enemy, said Steve Bannon. Not what you normally expect to hear from a right-winger, right and left breakdown here. Yeah. The opposite of corporate globalism in Bannon's analysis was what he called economic nationalism, also a term immensely open to misinterpretation. By economic nationalism, he meant the prosperity of the majority in the United States. That majority who saw its life chances from the previous in comparison with the previous generation to have declined. And they were right about that. These are the people that elected Donald Trump. These are folks who are saying that that wages have been flat for 40 years, that the sorts of possibilities my father had when he went into business 30 years ago are not there for me now, and that's a change that has resulted in my immiseration, in my getting poorer. And it was those people who were getting poor, at least in prospect, that finally said, I voted for hope and change with Barack Obama. I didn't get change and I've lost hope, and therefore I'm going to vote for someone now who seems to be speaking against the very people the corporate globalists, who are preventing that hope and change. That was Bannon's analysis, and he was right.
Yeah. So, well, let me just make a couple comments. First of all, speaking of Leo Panitch, he did a nice interview about the British situation on the podcast Dead Pundits Society. Very good hour-plus long interview. And you'll learn a lot more about the whole Corbyn thing and what's going on over there. Because Leo Panitch, who is from Canada, has been studied in Britain, has been involved with British left politics ever since he was an acolyte of Tony Benn, the Labour leader, going back to the 1960s. But I think what Panich would say and what Chomsky says about the right, about the populist right, is that the left, the socialist left, which he identifies with, should be doing things to get the right, to get those people, quote unquote, the white working class, etc., to better understand what it is that the socialist left really wants. They would be hopefully expansive and charitable enough to understand that a lot of those people should be, quote unquote, our people. Whereas Bannon is very clear in his Oxford talk, he's still dealing in the world of us and them. I mean, he sees the populist right as being, this is what it is, and the populist left as being those people. He sees himself as having triumphed at Donald Trump as being a triumph of the populist right over the populist left. And I don't think Steve Bannon, as far as I can tell, and I may be wrong about this, has any problem with that. He tips his cap to that, like in terms of the recent election for Congress. He tips his cap to the Democratic Party for having done a quote unquote better job, but he doesn't strategize or calculate like how can the so-called populist right get some of those voters. He sees it as kind of a sporting contest, and he sees it as a kind of this challenge. I mean, somebody who was in Goldman Sachs and so forth, who's been identified with all of these dominant institutions, and who's made all this money, he still sees things very much not in really visionary terms, but in sort of very much competitive terms. That's just one idea that may not bear out, but I think that's what I got from it.
I've thought for a while that we should simply abandon the terms left and right because they are so fraught with difficulties. When we have the Democratic Party's left in Congress calling for Julian Assange blood, for Assange to be brought home and given the full benefit of the law before he's locked away forever.
Yeah.
The notions have lost all their meaning. When we have people tell us that what happened in the last election was that the right-wing Donald Trump won over the left-wing Hillary Clinton, you don't know whether to laugh or cry because that is so far from an analysis of what actually happened. The left, even the example that you used of Noam Chomsky, a mentor and inspirer of this program, Noam Chomsky is cordially hated by many of the people who consider themselves and are considered left in the United States, like most of the Democratic Party. To say nothing of the left sectarians, that is to say the grouplets that see themselves as in the tradition of Marxism-Leninism. They cordially hate Chomsky because Chomsky is an anarchist. Chomsky is not a Marxist-Leninist and is severely critical of Marxism-Leninism from the left, if we're going to use that language, where left means the democratic side, I mean the popular side, God help me, the populist side, and only if we understand that do we realize that there's something profoundly wrong by our two-valued logic here. Are you left or right? Doesn't work. And one of the things Bannon saw, even if he saw inaccurately, was that left and right didn't work, and that he could talk about corporate globalism and its opposition as being opposed by a majority of the populace, the majority of the populace that would produce a president in 2016. He was right.
But I still get the feeling that Bannon, he believes that if you got rid of this administrative corporate state and let the market run free like a good libertarian, then things would be okay, and that separates him obviously from a libertarian socialist view.
That's right.
Chomsky would have.
Exactly.
And these are important distinctions, and it's not helping. It's not helping Bannon out, and plus Bannon doesn't really like the other anti-war libertarians, he doesn't seem to emphasize that anti-war aspect of what he's saying. So how far can you go with that? If you don't oppose war, how far can you go with this anti-corporate thing? The corporations are all about war.
Absolutely. And that's why the American left is not anti-war. If you look for any anti-war sentiment in American politics, you find it on the right, as we've used it, amongst paleo-conservatives like the Pat Buchanan we've just mentioned, or Ron Paul. These are the only people who are really saying that these wars are. What's remarkable, as a matter of fact, in recent politics has been the emergence of a few people in the Democratic Party realizing that the massive pro-war Democratic Party policies of the last generation and two may have some questionable aspects.
But of course, as long as you go to the so-called right and you found the anti-war libertarian right, you're gonna find some genuine racism with Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul and other people like that. And then that's going to provide more fodder for the anti-Trump and leftists.
It gets worse. I mean, Bannon, for all the things that I've been saying to try to rescue Bannon's reputation, Bannon cried up the actual fascist who has just become president of Brazil as an example of populism. There's a germ of truth in that, but in fact, this man is a dangerous fascist, and there's no question about it. And Bannon is the more deceived when he thinks that this is part of the project that he, in fact, has been describing and endorsing. He thinks it is, and that gives reason for the sort of criticism that you've offered of his views tonight, and weakens my defense, if that's the word, of what he's had to say. The point is, Rosa Luxemburg said, to proclaim loudly what is actually happening. It's hard.
Yeah, it is, and I listened to all these podcasts, the sort of leftist podcasts that I think in various ways provide insight into what's going on, but in no context have I heard any considered discussion of Steve Bannon like the one that we have just had. So this may be a YouTube first.
And that's no accident. It's important to understand that the American political establishment doesn't want the argument to be presented in its real terms. It has to be presented in these false terms. Racism, for example, as the motive for the economic nationalism that Bannon is speaking of. And as you suggest, the people who take that view sometimes give some excuse for that. Therefore, it's not nonsense. We're about to come to the end of News from Neptune today. There's one thing I really want to mention that I wanted particularly to mention, and that is the G20 and the events in the Black Sea, which are intimately connected. The government of Ukraine, which was installed, remember, by the Obama administration, and is the first government since the Second World War in Europe to contain explicit Nazis, real Nazis, not the fake Nazis we were talking about at the beginning of the program, that government staged a provocation of Russia that was clearly bound up with the G20 meeting in Argentina and Buenos Aires that's going on right now. The way it was connected was this: the American foreign policy, with its settled determination that no power shall constitute a peer competitor for the United States 1%, for the economic control exercised by the United States 1%, and that any time that Russia or China begin moving in that direction, they must be checked by war or threats of war. This has been the standard American policy at least since the Chinese Revolution in 1949. In many cases, it has produced real war in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere, where the American government has managed to kill between 20 and 30 million people to maintain to suppress the possibility of an economic integration of Eurasia that would challenge American control. Okay, it's a new chapter of that this week, where the Ukrainian incursion into Russian waters in the Black Sea seems to have been put up by Washington, or by what we inadequately call the deep state, and the Russians responded by taking military action to defend its territory in that regard. This is now being used by the neocons in Washington, who in fact are in charge of the American government, to prevent the meeting between Trump and Putin that was scheduled for the G20 conference. We've got to recognize once again who's in charge here. Donald Trump is the weakest American president in a century. And the fact of the matter is that the neocons who are in charge of the American government are making sure that the threat Trump represented, the threat of an understanding with Russia and China, rather than an opposition to their advancement, that threat has been neutralized by essentially the invasion of the Trump administration by neocons of the worst sort. John Bolton is just their cartoon exemplar. Now, this is what's going on in Buenos Aires right now. The possibility of peace breaking out between the United States and Eurasia is being programmatically undermined by the American deep state, by the agents of the American 1%, and Trump is the unfortunate volleyball going back and forth over the net on this matter.
Since we started out the program by being very critical of Counterpunch, let me at least recommend one article that I found very, very good in this morning's Counterpunch. It's titled "The Missing Piece in Gun Violence Discourse: The Porous Border Between Republic and Empire," and by someone named Manaz Momen, a woman who teaches at Texas A&M International University. And I think it gets at some of these relationships that we need to be talking about more between our local, domestic violence problems and our international violence problems.
And we'll conclude tonight with a note from our researcher, Dr. No, who lets the cat out of the bag. Julian Assange cat, known as Embassy Cat on Twitter, has been taken away from him. In late October 2018, an Ecuadorian judge told Assange, a hostage in the Ecuadorian embassy, that as part of his asylum agreement, he had to keep his cat under control, or he'd be evicted along with the cat. This requirement and others, including that he pay for his internet use, keep the bathroom clean, and pay for his food, were said to be, this is Dr. No, perfectly legal. Dr. No writes he knows of our strongly held views on Embassy Cat, so I thought we want to know what's going on. Meow. Okay, there we are. Yeah, I think that makes it clear. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 48th week of 2018, a Trump and Left edition. We should announce there's a demonstration in downtown Champaign tomorrow afternoon from 2 to 4 p.m. Weather permitting, against the war. These demonstrations have been going on since the invasion of Afghanistan. And if you don't know when that is, it's worth looking up. There will be no aware table at the market in Lincoln Square tomorrow, though, I'm afraid, in part because of the demonstration. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, with research by J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Crofton Coleman, with Andrew Scollery. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge.